Good evening, members. Welcome to our tonight's speaker event. Tonight, we're honored to host Professor Amy Chua virtually at the Oxford Union. Chua is an American lawyer, academic, and writer who currently teaches at the Yale Law School. In 2003, she published her first book, the New York Times Bestseller World on Fire. Chua's third book, Battle Hymn for the Tiger Mother, is a semi-autobiographical book about her strict parenting style. It was an international success and caused debates about parenting around the world. Equally, raising everyone's eyebrow is your most recent book, Political Tribes, which describes how group instinct relates to the fate of nations. Welcome, Amy. It's an honor to host you here tonight at Oxford Union.
Thanks so much, Shankai. It's such an honor to be participating in the Oxford Union. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. I want to start off the interview with a book review. The political commentator David Frum has reviewed your book, and he also addressed us at the Society previously. He referred you as an uncomfortable presence in American intellectual life.
From
your semi-autobiographical work to your work on political tribes, what have you done to earn this reputation? And what have you got that others don't have that makes people feel uncomfortable?
You know, it's so interesting. Everybody who knows me knows that I'm not trying to be controversial. You know, I know a lot of people, they want to be, they want to be bad boys. They want to cause firestorms. Everybody who knows me knows that I'm, a very well-liked professor. I just want to be liked. I think the answer is that I'm an outsider. Everything that I've written is slightly from the perspective of an outsider in the United States. So from parenting, I didn't think I was saying anything crazy. I was just describing the way my parents raised me. I described it very proudly. And I remember one Korean supporter said, "You gave away our secrets." But obviously I miscalculated because that was not the reception. And what I think is that I get my timing either right or wrong, depending on how you think about it. I think that right in 2011, the world was literally ready for this huge debate about parenting. I think in the West, there was all this percolating worry that maybe parenting had gotten too lax. So then, and there was also this fear of China rising at the same time. So when I published this book that the Wall Street Journal, without my permission, they put the headline, "Why Chinese Mothers Are Superior," which is not my view at all, but that's the headline they slapped on it. I think that explains that controversy. And then with political tribes, I just kind of call it like it is. Most of the books that do very well in the United States are either very, very anti-Trump or very, very pro-Trump. And that's exactly tribalism in action. And I try to write about step away from the fray and kind of diagnose the problem, what's happening in the United States. And so I get it from both sides.
Thank you. Thank you for being very honest. And I think this is an opportunity for you to speak to our members about your insights from parenting to political tribes. And let's start with parenting. Parents in America think your parenting style is Chinese, is cruel, whereas in China, parents also ask the question, is this really Chinese? Have you been wrongly labeled and misunderstood by both sides? And if so, what actually motivated you to start this work?
Yeah, after I published the book and suddenly found myself in this international controversy being called a child abuser. And one label is the worst mother in the world. I was kind of upset for like a couple of years, feeling very misunderstood. But now that it's been 10 years, exactly 10 years, believe it or not, it came out January 11th, 2011. I feel privileged. I feel privileged that even though I've been misunderstood, that I've been part of this global conversation. To begin with, I am not a parenting expert. The other books you mentioned, it took me 7 years of research to write my first book. I wrote this Battle Hymn memoir. I wrote the first 3/4 of it in 3 months. And the real stories, if you get to the end of the book, so I have 2 daughters. The first is really easy kid, self-motivated. And I thought, what is so hard about this parenting? And then my second kid came along, Lulu, who was just a born rebel. And so a lot of the book is actually supposed to be funny and tongue in cheek. And, some people who read it get it, they think it's funny. And other people who are not from my background read it literally and just think it's horrible. But the last third of the book is not funny because what happened is my daughter Lulu rebelled, like a lot of teenagers do, but she rebelled against this strict parenting and it was ugly. It was not funny. And I really thought I might lose her. And that's why I actually wrote the book, not to preach about a great way of parenting, but really to kind of address, what do I do here? It worked for me. I really love the way my parents raised me as an immigrant's kid. But this is clearly not working here. So in some ways, the book, I'm still a very proud, strict parent, but in some ways, I think the book is about how to draw on the best of East and West in parenting. And by the way, I don't think it is about Chinese parenting. I say very early in the book that if anything, it's more like, in the United States, it's more like immigrant style parenting, immigrant tough love. Like some of my biggest supporters in this country were Nigerian Americans, Cuban Americans, Irish Americans, Korean Americans, Indian Americans, just people who came from another culture and were first generation, and their parents are like, you'd better do well because we may not survive here.
I think that's very interesting how different cultural groups respond to your parenting differently. And I think that's been a constant theme through all your book and all your research. And being raised in an immigrant family, how does your childhood experience influence the way how your parenting works for your two daughters?
Everything comes down to my parents. So my parents arrived in the United States in 1960 without a penny. I was privileged educationally because they were coming to be graduate students. So this is not a sob story, but my dad was the black sheep of his family. They were actually Chinese from the Philippines. And so they eloped and didn't know anybody in this country. My mom barely spoke English. And I am the oldest of four daughters. And my parents raised me super strict. All the things that were sort of tongue in cheek in my book, like you have to get an A, a B+ is a failing grade. I was kind of half joking with my own kids because I was actually born in the United States. So it's semi-satirical, but the way that my parents raised me, they didn't think it was funny. They really didn't want me to do sleepovers. I have a joke about no sleepovers, no play dates. And that is part of being an outsider. So my Western friends, they're like, what is this horrible parenting? But the explanation is my mother didn't know anybody in this country. So I remember when I was like 5 in Indiana, I'm like the only Asian student in my whole school. And I wanted to have a sleepover. And I asked my mom and she practically broke down. And she was like, I just don't understand, Amy. We have a bed here for you in our house. Why do you need to go to someone else's house to sleep? And who are these people? So it was partly being an outsider. They didn't know any of this. So I would say that in a way, the battle hymn was about this awakening. Like I couldn't fake it. I wanted to raise my kids the same way that my parents raised me, as these like poor, starving immigrants. So everything they said to me made sense. But when I would say to my own daughters who grew up much more privileged, I'd say, you have to get A's. Lulu was like, why? Why? Everything was why. I don't get it. And so in some ways, it relates to a second book I've written called The Triple Package. I think a lot of this is generational. If you look at Chinese Americans in the United States that are second or third generation, that is, their grandparents or even great grandparents were the immigrants, they do not parent like this. They do not want their kids to do well in math. They want them to be poets and comedians. And so it's very much, I think, in some ways, an immigrant phenomenon.
That's very interesting. And I relate very strongly to your personal experience. I came to this country with my parents as the first generation immigrants. The only difference is I came to this country when I was 15 years old and you were 5 years old. I guess there's a bit difference where I kind of tried to understand there's a cultural difference as well as a generational difference. But how do you view this kind of style of parenting where while you were young, you didn't quite understand this. And how did that change as you're growing up? You can talk about this in your experience and also with your daughters. How's your
Yeah.
relationship change with them?
So, in some ways I learned a lot of lessons with my younger daughter, but I stand a very proud, strict tiger mom. The book coined the term notoriously. And I think the reason for that is that I genuinely believe that you can't just give your children self-esteem and inner strength. I mean, if I could just say you're amazing all day, and then my children would have self-esteem and strength, man, I would do that in a second. That's so much more fun. But I do believe that genuine self-esteem, genuine resilience has to be earned, that a child has to kind of earn it by overcoming a difficult challenge. So in the book, I talk about my younger daughter. Actually, I think she was afraid of failure. She said she didn't want to go to college. She had this high achieving older sister. She said, I want to be a garbage man. I can't do it. So part of her rebellion, I believe, was fear of failure. And I tell these funny stories, but I think there was this one time when she absolutely thought she couldn't do this piano piece. And we were fighting and it was awful and yelling. And my husband was like, Amy, this is too much. Like maybe she just can't physically do it. And I was like, oh, you just don't believe in her. And, we went back at it. And suddenly at one point, her two hands came together. The piece was called The Little White Donkey. And she could suddenly play this piece. And my daughter, Lulu, who fights with me a lot even now, she does give me credit for that moment. She says, Mom, I remember that moment. It was this moment where I thought, oh my God, I really thought I couldn't do it. But just by sticking to it and not giving up, I actually could do it. And, she said later when I was in high school, having a blank on a chemistry test, I would actually remember that moment. Like, wait a minute, I felt this way before. If I just keep trying. So I do believe that there are some very positive aspects of this kind of tough love parenting, but the book is also quite subtle because I think that a lot of Asian parents do not pay enough attention to the individual personalities of their children. I have wearing my other hat as a professor, I have so many miserable Asian Americans who didn't want to be a doctor. They don't even want to be in law school, some of them. Some of them want to be fashion designers, but they are stuck because their parents say you have to have this career. So in a way, what I touch on in a personal way in Battle Hymn, I explore in a more rigorous academic way in this other book, The Triple Package, where I talk about a lot of the psychological costs of this kind of strict parenting if you don't listen and afford some flexibility in your approach.
Mm-hmm. Well, both of your daughters are extremely successful now. You must be very proud of how you parented them, and it's 10 years on. But do you think parenting, when do you think parenting stops? Or is there a different cultural expectation that's different from the West and the East?
Well, parenting in a way never stops in the sense that I'm always worried. I mean, I'm so, when I say successful, I think the thing that I'm most proud of is the fact that both my daughters, after all this, Sturm and Drang, love coming home. Now we're friends, I think if they didn't want to come home and bring their friends, then I would feel that I had failed, even if they did very well in school. But what you're asking is, this is something people don't understand because there's so many different kinds of parenting, like helicopter parenting. I don't know what they call it in the UK, but this kind of over possessive parenting. The way I see tiger parenting is actually the opposite of that, which is that it should really be mostly about early childhood. You arm your kids with the skills and the grit and the resilience to not give up. And then it's like, when my kids went to college, I was actually much more hands off. I was still kind of in the background, but I didn't write their papers for them. I didn't, if you're at some point, I do think kids have to learn what it feels like to fail. You're not going to get everything handed to you. So in a funny way, I think parenting psychologically goes on and on. You're always worried. And we're all very predictable. Is my child going to be happy? Does she find somebody? But I think the part about education and learning, in some ways, I think that the ideal tiger parenting should kind of should be phased out from like 14, 15, 16 until, you send them off to college and they should pretty much be on their own. with just support, of course, but I mean, not like, hectoring.
It's great to see how you've drawn from your own experience, from your own parenting, to another book, The Triple Package, where you try to figure out what are the qualities, characteristics, and elements that actually contribute to success, and not just in parenting, but in general, in your career, in your education. And some of the reasons you came up with, there are three factors. It's a combination of a sense of superiority, insecurity, and resilience.
Yeah.
So I wondered about this. How do those two beliefs, superiority and insecurity, how you can hold those two beliefs simultaneously at the same time?
Yeah. So, it's funny. This book also created a lot of controversy. It's called The Triple Package. And I believe that a lot of times my books are controversial when people don't actually read them. They just kind of hear about them. If you actually read this book, it should be the opposite of controversial, because we look at the most successful groups in America at a given time. And the first thing we notice is that these groups change over time. So we actually reject explanations like genetic explanations, because in fact, some of the most successful groups in America, when I wrote the book 3 years ago, included groups who had immigrated from Africa and groups from Latin America, the Cuban Americans. So it's not an ethnic or racial thing. And also we learned that the groups change over time. So Greek Americans were incredibly successful 50 years ago. And we also learned that groups fade generationally. So again, going back to Chinese Americans or Korean Americans, if you look at their we're measuring success in a very conventional way, just sort of income and education levels. And, I give the big caveat that that is not the only form of happiness or success or meaning. But just looking at this grid, we identified 8 groups that were hitting it out of the park in the United States. And they were surprising. Jewish Americans, Mormon Americans, Nigerian Americans, Indian Americans, I think Taiwanese Americans, and so on. And so we were looking like, what do these groups have in common? And we found these 3 characteristics, which we call the triple package. And the first is a sense of, we call it a superiority complex, but it's really the sense of exceptionalism. So for Mormons and Jews, it's like, we're the chosen people, or, Persian Americans, extremely successful. In their case, it's the sense of, we come from this great antiquity, this great civilization. We descend from the Persian Empire. So that's the first trait, a superiority complex. But if you just had that, you could just be arrogant. Like, I'm so superior, I don't need to do anything. So what we found is all these groups shared a second characteristic, which is a sense of insecurity, often because these groups are a little bit outsiders. There's that point again. Often because they're immigrants, or they're viewed as really not normal. The Mormons are viewed as a peculiar people. And it's that contradiction that you identify, the sense that we're special, and yet we're not recognized. People are looking down on us. They don't think we belong. That combination, and I have a lot of studies to back this up, is an amazing combination. It actually creates this almost like a chip on the shoulder effect that makes people, it creates motivation, which is, I'm going to show everybody. We've got to, these people are making fun of us. We've got to show the world. And the third characteristic is impulse control, which is just, the ability to bear down and work. And this applies not just at the group level, but at the individual level. I think I used Margaret Thatcher, and certainly Steve Jobs was a classic case. Everybody said he was practically narcissistic, like this huge ego, but he was also incredibly insecure. He had this constant chip on the shoulder, and people said that just made him work and work and work. He never felt that he was successful enough. And, you could see what happened with him.
I think that's very interesting. You draw this up with the cultural groups and you describe them as outsider. I guess we're going to touch a bit more on this when we talk about political tribes, where you see this ongoing political battle between the immigrant success outsider story versus what kind of we call nativism. But you've outlined the quality for success. But what do you think is the worst quality you could imagine in a person? Is that laziness, dishonesty, impatience, or what are the things you're trying to avoid to make sure your children don't pick up any of those habits and qualities?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, dishonesty. I mean, I actually talk about this in the triple package, the dangers and dark side of it, that if you have such a desire to prove yourself and show to everybody, then, there are dangers. Like, first of all, you could feel depressed all the time that you're not good enough. But the other thing is you could just lose yourself, So I always say that honesty and integrity is the most important thing. I mean, you see cheating, this feeling like, oh my gosh, I got to prove it to my parents. So myself, I think that generosity is an incredibly important trait. That's neither here nor there, but since you asked me, but yes, and empathy. So the book is kind of, I try to be very clear that I'm not talking about how to be a successful human being. It's just more that there's a lot of talk of loss of upward mobility in the United States. And when I investigated what groups are actually doing well, including some groups that started off very poor, a lot of people, they say, oh, these immigrants, they came over wealthy or successful. Studies show from Canada and Los Angeles and New York City that a lot of these Chinese Americans and Korean Americans come over blue collar. They're laundry workers, they're restaurant workers, they're illiterate. And even so, their children rise. So the idea was like, how can we learn from this in our education system? And even with underprivileged groups, how can we translate this into policies rather than just pouring money in, indiscriminately?
I think that's very interesting. You highlighted the immigrants who are from poorer working class background, and they have this upper social mobility. And do you see this clash with some of the white kids nowadays? The media are talking about is the left behind of the white population has been treated badly by the system, especially with policy measures such as positive discrimination or affirmative action, as people call it in the States.
Yeah.
What's your view on that?
I mean, this is something we'll get to when we talk about my most recent book, Political Tribes. I think this explains the election of Donald Trump. It's a huge problem in the United States. I think there are shades of it in the UK, but it's nothing like in the United States. I mean, in the United States, for 200 years, this country was dominated economically, politically, and culturally by a white majority. Obviously, there's a lot of scholarship on what white means, and it's kind of a moving target. For a while, Jews and even Irish were not considered white for a while, but that was the basic dynamic. And when you have one group that's so dominant, it can do terrible things. I mean, we have slavery and persecution, but this majority can also afford to be more generous. And that's what happened in the 60s and 70s. A lot of these WASP elites, these white Protestant elites, basically just voluntarily opened up the Ivy League to African Americans and Asians and minorities. They're like, they were generous. That is not where we are now, because for the first time in US history, whites are about to lose their majority status at the national level. This is a huge change. It's a massive demographic change where whites will no longer be the majority. And studies show that it's because whites are on the verge of losing the majority status that at this moment in America, every group feels insecure. It's African Americans, Asian Americans, Latinos feel insecure, but whites feel insecure too. A study shows that over 50% of white Americans feel that they are subject to more discrimination than minorities. And it's really the factors you describe. It's not just, in particular, it's the working class white group, which was President Trump's base. That group, because of affirmative action in schools, because they often come from very poor backgrounds where they don't have this kind of immigrant parent telling them that education is important. This poor working class white group in the United States is probably the single least represented at a place like Yale University. So I'm very much in favor. We have lots of diversity and minorities, and we've done a good job. But if you ask how many poor whites from rural Appalachia do we have, it's like 1 out of 250 per class. I mean, it's our most underrepresented group. So that's part of what's causing this huge upheaval in the United States. A group that was formerly dominant and thought they owned the country for 200 years is now feeling left out of everything. And in particular, this working class group, they feel left out of Congress, left out of Wall Street, left out of the Ivy League, left out of Silicon Valley, left out of everything.
So in your most recent book, Political Tribes, you pointed out this group instinct is a natural thing. You could be a fan or supporter of a football team, you could watch sports, you belong to a certain group. But precisely at this point in America, when people identify them of different groups, like I'm working class, I'm from the LGBTQ community, people twisted this and push identity politics to its worst nature, and tribalism awakening America. But how does this compare to the triple package, where you argue this group instinct and belonging to a group actually contributed to some group's success?
Yeah, I think it's completely consistent. So with Political Tribes, I open up with a whole bunch of really interesting psychological studies that basically show that human beings, like our fellow primates, we are tribal creatures. We just have to belong to groups. It's our instinct. I mean, think how few hermits there are. But what's interesting is there's a neurological basis for it. So once you connect with a group, our tendency is to want to kind of cling to that group and defend it and see it as better in every way. I don't know if Oxford has do you guys have a competition with Cambridge or something like that? Or I don't know. We have Harvard Yale rivalry, and you see it in sports. It's like whoever your main rival is, you always think that your team is better. You always think the referee is wrong if they call it the other way. And so
never mind the sports, we've got the Oxford Union here, and the Cambridge has their version of the union. So there's always competition going on there as well.
Got it. So what I say is that tribalism is not necessarily bad. In sports, it can be fun, and what you mentioned, but it's when tribalism takes over a political system, that's when things get dangerous. Because then every group starts to see reality through its own group's lens. And that's where we've come in America today. Basically, we are at a point in the United States where our two political parties, or pro-Trump people and anti-Trump people, it's about 50-50, can't speak to each other. And it's not just that they disagree with each other, they see the other side as evil and un-American and almost like enemies. And you see politics right now, my colleagues, Yale is extremely liberal. From the moment Donald Trump was elected, there would be one scandal after another. Everyone was saying, now he's going to be impeached. He's going to be out. And then you would look at the polls, exactly the same. His supporters still backed him. And that's what I mean. When tribalism takes over a political system, you basically, you're like, okay, he's my team's leader. And yeah, I wasn't so happy with this, and that was stupid, but I am defending him no matter what, because that's my team, and that's the point we are in the United States right now, which is a very dangerous thing, because when you have a situation where the two political parties don't view each other just as fellow human beings in an American project, but actually one side is the enemy, then it's a recipe for civil war. So that's why tribalism is not always bad. Sometimes at the individual group level, it can be very, very effective within a family. But at the national level, when tribalism takes over the whole political system, facts don't matter, data doesn't matter, policies don't matter. You can't even have a real conversation. I have to flip between our two news stations, the conservative station and the liberal station, to even figure out what the truth is about the pandemic. Does this drug work or not? They're saying opposite things, and it's a really dangerous situation.
Oh, I think you're making a very good point with tribalism, how within the same tribe, the pro-Trump people say Trump got impeached, and people take that as a fact. On the more that's the anti-Trump side. And the more pro-Trump side, they just say, he won the election, Biden has stolen the election from him. And this is kind of the echo chamber, not just a liberal echo chamber, but it's an echo chamber either way within the tribe. What do you think the media's role in shaping this kind of outcome? And what
terrible. Yeah. I mean, everybody knows social media has played such a huge role in this. You could see it at the university level, the political level. basically now everybody is just hearing what they want to hear, and then it gets reinforced. It's interesting. The first book that you mentioned, World on Fire, I coined this term market dominant minorities. It was very provocative at the time. You're right. I seem to always get in trouble. But I identified this phenomenon that I again know about because I'm an outsider in the United States. So my parents are from the Philippines, and in Southeast Asia, it's very common for the economy in a country like Indonesia or the Philippines or Malaysia. The economy is actually controlled, dominated by this tiny Chinese minority. The Chinese represent only 3% of the population in Indonesia, but they control as much as 70% of Indonesia's economy. And when this book came out, everyone was like, oh my God, are you stereotyping? And I was like, no, it's statistical. And what happens in countries with a market dominant minority, it's viewed like an outsider group. In many ways, the same groups I identified in the triple package. They're controlling everything, and they're not even real Indonesians. They're outsiders. So coming back to political tribes, in the United States, we never had this problem because it was always whites that dominated everything. And we didn't have this problem of a little minority. But what I have identified recently is because of this massive demographic change where so much immigration has come in that whites are losing their majority status. And a second factor, which is something that you identified, which is our white majority has been split along educational lines. So our rural, blue collar, kind of inland whites are so different from the whites that are cosmopolitan, that live in New York City and Los Angeles and attend Oxford and Yale. Those two groups of whites are so alienated from each other. They have so little interaction that they are almost what social scientists think of as different ethnic groups. That is, it is much more common for a white person who attends Yale or NYU or Columbia to marry an Asian American or a South Asian from the same similar background, educational background, than it is for that cosmopolitan elite white to marry somebody from rural Alabama. I mean, there's no interaction. So the result of this, I say, is that I think we're starting to see in the United States for the first time the rise of our own version of a market dominant minority. And it's different because we're a country of immigrants. It's not an ethnic group. It's not a religious group. It is basically this group that we call cosmopolitan elites. And I think you have some version of it in the UK too. They're the people that are in favor of the EU. They're the people at Oxford. And so these cosmopolitan elites are in the United States, tend to live on the coasts, and they actually do control huge sectors of our country. They control Wall Street and Silicon Valley and Washington. And what I say in my books is that in countries with a market dominant minority, what's dangerous is that democracy, you can't assume it's a panacea. That in these countries, majority rule, where you have elections, it will often give rise to a demagogue, somebody like Robert Mugabe, who says, you know why we're all poor? It's because of these outsiders that control everything, and we need to take back the country. So in a funny way, I think that's what I wrote in Political Tribes is that is what Donald Trump did in 2016. He actually did the same kind of thing as Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, even though they were on opposite sides of the political spectrum. He was a very demagogic figure who said, we need to make America great again. It's all these cosmopolitan elites, the swamp, and these successful immigrants that are taking over everything. And they also don't care about real Americans. They care more about the poor in Africa. They're globalists, and that was very resonant for this group of especially poor, working class, white Americans, many of them with drug addiction problems, low education, and he really spoke to them. That was the base. So that's how I understand the election. And by the way, of my colleagues at Yale Law School, I was the only one to predict that election correctly, the 2016 election. And I predicted the 2020 election correctly too.
That's very good. Let's just go back to the 2016 election then. According to your theory, it's because it's demographic change. Do you think it's the insecurity of the white people in the US that pushed Trump over the line? If that is the case, how do you distinguish the people who voted for Trump, as the media would label them, and media, as people would argue, is part of the liberal elite who perpetuate this argument? To say, how do you distinguish people who voted for Trump who are racist and bigoted, and who are the people who voted for Trump out of this economic anxiety?
Yeah, I always find this conversation just more of an example of political tribalism. I mean, to me, it's obvious. It's obvious that there is a huge new problem of white nationalism in this country that stems from that same insecurity. They feel the country is being taken away from them. And you should see the hate mail I get. It's disgusting. I mean, so I personally know that there is a lot of racism. I get it every day, my inbox, my Twitter feed, horrible. But having said that, I think it's not very helpful. I see a lot of my colleagues, brilliant people, Oxford and Cambridge educated, they come back and they just think every Trump voter is a racist. I just think that that's part of the problem, because basically if somebody calls you a racist, that's not going to make you want to have a dialogue. That's going to make you have your backup. So the vocabulary that both sides have right now is so intense. Sort of fun fact, Joe Biden's, the new president's, his chief of staff, Ron Klain, is a brilliant guy. He was my classmate at Harvard Law School, and he really loved Political Tribes, this book, which is a lot about a call for unity in some ways. So you'll see, I'm a very big fan of President Biden's rhetoric and the way his approach, and it's kind of what I thought would be the best for the country after 4 years of disastrous, just increasing vitriol. So I see this latest election as really trying to be about, let's just take down the temperature. Let's stop calling each other out and calling everybody a racist. And so I'm hopeful. So to answer your question, I don't know the exact percentage. I do think that my view is that there are plenty of racists out there, but I also know, as I open my book, one of the big shocks of the 2020 election is that Trump got a very significant portion of Latino Americans, African Americans. That percentage actually went up. A lot of Asian Americans voted for him. So then the first thing I see in the media, it's like, oh, those people are also racist. It's a false consciousness. I know what they mean. I'm not trying to make fun of that. But what I say in the book is that back to this idea of a market dominant minority, these cosmopolitan elites in the United States, the ones who go to Yale and Harvard, who live in Los Angeles and San Francisco and Miami and Chicago, all of my friends, I'm one, and Barack Obama, they think they're very cosmopolitan and tolerant, but they're actually incredibly snobby. They can be incredibly exclusionary. They tend to be very dismissive of people who are religious. You hear these comments about like these idiotic people who go to church and have guns. And so I think that you'll see why were so many poor Latinos voting for Trump. And I wrote about this in Political Tribes. It's a huge portion of the poor Latinos in this country are evangelical. They're very, very religious. And Trump spoke to that group. And a lot of my cosmopolitan elite friends never even knew that. They don't know anything about evangelicals, and there's a lot of scorn for NASCAR race car driving. I don't know if you guys in the UK even know what that is, but in worldwide wrestling, there's a lot of tribalism, even when it comes to what kind of sports you like, so there's the kind of things that Trump's base watches, like NASCAR race car driving, and then what, cosmopolitan elites watch. So that's kind of my explanation for 2020 too, that you really have to understand that it's not helpful just to say if you think only racists are going to vote for Trump, you're going to miscall the election.
Well, I'm delighted to tell you, you are our first speaker that we've heard since President Biden's inauguration this week.
Oh,
And good to know there are people in his office have read your work, Political Tribes.
yeah,
But
I think he's got a great team.
if there are some advice you can give to Biden's team to fix this problem of identity politics that's so vitriolic in the US, what would that be?
Um, a lot of the studies that I show, I cite, show that if you can get, I mean, so there are all these depressing studies. I won't go into them because we're all depressed enough. I mean, tribalism can get really bad. But all these studies also show that if you can get two people from opposite political tribes to actually interact as human beings, like you don't tell them what party they're from, but have them talk about pets, dogs, their children, pizza, sports, anything, and have them relate at that level first, it's unbelievable how much progress can be made. So I try to do this in my own class. I lay down a lot of rules. I'm very proud that my class is one of the few at Yale that is not segregated, that I have a lot of conservative students, but I have a huge number of people of color because of who I am, very progressive. And, I try to like set the rules, like don't immediately assume that what that person said is racist just because you don't quite like the way they phrased it. So advice, like a lot of people have been talking about a national service program, because we used to have the draft in this country where back in Vietnam, you'd have like rich people, rich whites would go fight side by side with African Americans and Latino Americans and Italian Americans. And, Vietnam was a disaster. I wrote about that. But the one tiny good thing is that there was a lot of bonding that happened across classes and races during that time. And we don't have that anymore. Our cosmopolitan elites have no contact with the rest of the country. So one thing that a lot of people have been toying around with that's getting increasing popularity is this idea of a national service program where you have people, young people, maybe after high school, from, fancy private schools. Well, how about instead of your gap year where you go to Australia or Guatemala, what if you go to a different part of the United States and engage side by side with other young people, but from a different social class, not in a condescending way, like we're going to teach you, but, on some common project. Like we have huge problems after the pandemic, housing. So I think that's something that's maybe gaining traction. I know Pete Buttigieg, who ran for president, was championing it also. It's got a lot of bipartisan support. I think something like that would be a great first step in starting to sort of take away all this mutual suspicion and ignorance between the kind of coast and the cosmopolitan Americans, who, by the way, include a lot of immigrants and immigrants' kids, and the kind of heartland of the country in the South, President Trump's base. If we can start to kind of eat away at that mutual ignorance, I think that would be a great first step.
I think that's some really useful tips and takeaways, especially getting people to speak to each other. It's more like a political speed dating from different groups, put them together. We shall definitely try this out at the union once our socials resumes after the pandemic. So before I move on to audience questions, just to remind all the audience, please submit your questions with your name and college so I can accredit you while asking the question directly to Amy. And one final question from me, Amy, before I open up to our members. This term, we're trying to do this thing we ask every speaker we host online. What is this one thing that we should all be worried about and thinking about, but we're not currently doing so? What would be that one thing for you?
Well, this is not very original, but I think listening to social media and news from the other side. I know it's not very original, but I can see it in my colleagues. Like it's literally like we live in two different worlds. I think our news system and our newspapers are a little different than yours, but we have cable news where literally half the country watches some stations, and the other half, the cosmopolitan elites, watches the other stations. And if you flip between these two stations, it's like two different worlds. You're not even in the same country. So I would say force yourself, however disgusted you feel by people on the other side, to kind of see what they're reading and saying, but maybe with an open mind, as opposed to, oh, look how dangerous these people are, but kind of like, what is, I think it comes back to trying to see everybody as human beings first. So that's not very original, but I think that's the best thing I can say for trying to get the problem of tribalism.
Thank you, Amy. So now I've got some questions from the audience, our student members, for you. One of the questions from Sam Ling. Thank you for your talk. You've mentioned how difficult it was to instill the same sense of motivating insecurity to your daughters, which your own mother gave you as a first-generation immigrant. How can the succeeding generation continue to install this outsider insecure identity in their children's? And do you think your own daughters will be able to keep that going if they wanted to?
Great question. And I got to tell you, it's so hard. I'm just warning you guys now, First, I think there's an interesting question whether it is even the right thing to do. One thing that I noticed in my research is that the first generation, people like you guys, if you're an immigrant's kid or an immigrant, you tend to want to be successful professionally in things like law or business or politics, something very prominent and tangible. But what happens is with second and third generation, you see your children wanting to be maybe a playwright or a poet. You're not making so much money. But I think that's important to see that that's extremely valuable for our society. That could be very fulfilling. Maybe that's more successful. So I think that is a flaw. I love immigrants. I'm all about immigrant mentality. But one big flaw is, I think, the narrowness of our definition of success. Ironically, when I told my mom I was going to law school, she started weeping. This is like 50, so many years ago, but back then she was like, law. She didn't know anything about that. She wanted me to be a doctor, So, but to take his question more seriously, I think it's a real problem. It's a cycle, right? Because I started off with very little, but I'm not wealthy at all, but we live very comfortably. So my kids have a nice house and they vacation in nice places. And let me tell you, it is so much harder to light a fire, to motivate them, because without that fear, like, oh my gosh, I remember my parents would be like, you might be out on the streets if you don't do well at school. And they weren't kidding, like I had so many student loans. Whereas my kids, they kind of know that I'm gonna, even if they did nothing, I'm probably gonna support them. So in some ways, he's asked me the question that is the link between triple package and battle him. How do you instill the sense of insecurity in your children when it seems like pretty bad parenting to want to do that, right? Like if you were to tell a Westerner, I'm trying to instill some insecurity in my child so that they will be motivated, I think that would be considered very troubling. So that's kind of the interesting thing. How can you simultaneously tell your children, I believe in you? I am saying that I'm criticizing you or I'm giving you this feedback because I believe that you can be more, but I will love you no matter what, and still motivate them. I think that's the trick.
Well, along the same line of parenting, I've got a question from Shannon Young, St. Anne's College. She's asking, do you think this tiger parenting will evolve as the digital age continues, as technology becomes increasingly important factor in young children's lives? How would that be like, the tough love tiger parenting?
Oh my gosh, I feel so old getting these questions. Like I've been teaching on Zoom with, I'm so bad technologically. I'm just going to speak out of ignorance because I believe that this phenomenon that I'm identifying is probably something that will never go away. It may not always be immigrants. It may not be Chinese people. Interestingly, in China, as China gets more successful, a lot of parents there don't want to be tiger parents, because they're worried that their children are so stressed out. And if the school is already, schools in China are so stressful, maybe it's not good for the parents to also be so strict. But going back to the digital thing, I think I don't know how it's going to look. But one of the signs of success or the characteristics I talk about is impulse control, self-discipline. So the question I get most from young parents is, my kid is on the computer all day. What do I do? But I've been told by very, very successful young people that you're just too old. You don't get it. You can learn a lot. You know, my daughter Lulu says, I learned so much on the internet. Like I know all about current events, and you know, I know so much more than your generation ever did. So I can't answer that answer. I'm not even going to try because I'm so bad at technology and, you know, the digital economy.
Well, I guess nowadays we are all stuck in front of the computer screens anyway.
Right. No choice.
This is a very interesting question for you from a member called Lu Yao. Thank you for coming to the union. Have you considered making your inspiring books into movies? Like one of your students, J.D. Vance, Hellbilly Elegy, just came out last year.
Yeah, J.D. Vance, I'm so proud of that. J.D. was from the people that you would call Trump's base. And he was my student, and he wrote his book that became a bestseller and is now a huge Netflix, hit. He wrote it for me as a class paper. So fun fact, they actually did want to make a movie and a TV series out of Battle Hymn of the Tiger Mother. But it was so difficult at that time. You know, I've never been on TV before. I was just a mild-mannered Yale professor. Suddenly I'm being called like a child abuser, a monster everywhere. So we decided not to make the movie. It was actually some really big producers and directors. I think I now regret it. But I remember at the time, my daughters were like, I remember Lulu said, they're gonna make me a drug addict, and, you know, and they're gonna take, you know, everyone's gonna be making fun of me. And it was the only time I listened to my children that I shouldn't have.
Thank you for your brilliant answer. Then we've got another question from Molly Mantle, St. Hugh's College. You've written so much about conflicts caused by globalization and exported democracy. How do you think the increasing tribalism you've described in the US would affect other countries around the world?
Great. So it's actually funny. I started off backwards. For the first 20 years of my academic career, I focused on ethnic conflict or tribalism in developing countries. Again, I was identifying this problem of market dominant minorities, and it's not just in Southeast Asia, but in Africa too. You have obviously whites in South Africa, whites in Zimbabwe, but also groups like South Asians in countries like Kenya or Uganda or the Lebanese and West Africa. So I've written about that globally in developing countries. And only recently, it was actually in a class of mine when I was talking about ethno-nationalism and all these dynamics and demagogues and populism. And I was talking about Venezuela, and a student raised her hand and said, Professor Chua, it sounds, this is right after the election of Donald Trump, it actually sounds like you're describing the United States. So I was like, a light bulb went off. And after that, I did a year and a half of research. And that's when Political Tribes came out, that I moved my lens of tribalism back to the United States, because I previously had not really focused on the United States. So I think the most interesting countries for your purposes are countries like the UK or Europe. And again, I don't like to speak as a non-expert, but I do think that there are similar variations in the UK. I think you have your own version of what I call cosmopolitan elites. I would imagine that a lot of people that were in favor of Brexit were more like, I'm just guessing, the kind of people that were very anti-globalization in the United States. I imagine there's some group of people who feel left behind in the UK that might be white, that feel like all these immigrants are coming in and they're rising. So I think that there is a lot of probably interesting parallels. The big difference is that the United States is a country of immigrants from the beginning, and our percentage of minorities is just so much larger, except for the fact that if you look at specific cities, I'm guessing if you look at London or some of these cities, then the UK will look very similar to the United States.
Mm-hmm. So you've wrote extensively on globalization, and people often take the sign when Trump first got elected in 2016 as a sign of America trying to reverse globalization withdrawing from its leadership globally. Do you think with the pandemic that we've been through and we're currently still in, would this accelerate the process of the reversal of globalization, or would that slow this down?
Oh boy, great question. You're absolutely right. Trump was, along with many European leaders, kind of anti-globalization, kind of enough already. I think even with Joe Biden, who was, I think originally, he's a much more internationally focused person, much more cosmopolitan person. Even he, taking over 4 years later with this pandemic, can see that he can't go all the way back to 4 years ago. There is just so much more distrust now of China. So I don't know. It's a great question because there are vectors in both directions. On the one hand, the pandemic is so global that if there's not global coordination, you can see it, everything crosses borders. But on the other hand, there's this idea that, oh my God, we got it from this country, or we got it from this country. Let's close our borders. So I don't know which way it's going to go. I think that we're definitely in a moment of not total free trade right now. Even among cosmopolitan elites, there's this sense that we don't want to go all the way back to Trump's America first, because that was very destructive. But there is this sense that a lot of people felt left behind by globalization, and that something has to be done to address that.
That's great. I've got one final question from Prima and Zeus, which they ask, how are and will Chinese American youth and mothers leverage and engage with the China on the rise, and with the potential risk of being caught at the intersection of this global superpower rivalry?
So the beginning of the question was what?
So how would the Chinese Americans, the immigrants from China who settled in the US,
yeah,
I guess all across the world, in the UK as well, how would they engage?
Problem. Yeah, so it's a huge problem. And again, it's very generational. So if you look at Chinese Americans who are born in this country, or, they've been here 3 or 4 generations, they have zero identification with China. I think the tricky cases are the ones that are similar to you. That is, they're either their parents just came from China, or they themselves came from China at a young age. And in the United States, under President Trump, it was a very dangerous situation for people of Chinese ethnicity. My own father, still doing really well, 84. He's a professor at Berkeley. There's huge fear in the Chinese community that you're going to be singled out as a spy. And it's terrifying. Like you're afraid that if you go to China, they're going to think you're on America's side, and then or in the United States, they're going to be, they're going to lock you up. So I think I will say that in my whole life, I started off in this country as the only Chinese kid in my class. There was nobody. I was in the Midwest, and it was fine. There was some discrimination, some bullying, but I was fine. I did well. People liked me. It wasn't so bad. I think this moment in America is actually one of the worst I've ever seen in my whole life. There's a lot of suspicion. There's every night, if you turn on Fox News, it's China did this, China did that. And I get horrible emails. Horrible. Go back. So I think it's pretty dangerous right now. And I think it's a real struggle for people of Chinese ethnicity, certainly in the United States.
Well, thank you, Amy, for all your answers and spending time with us. I've thoroughly enjoyed our 1-hour discussion. Hopefully one day we can invite you back to return to the chamber at the Oxford Union. And for all the members who are lucky enough to get into the meet and greet, you would have received the link to join another Zoom meeting with Amy afterwards. But thank you, Amy. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me. And thanks to everybody who joined.